In this video, I will be comparing the zcam E2-F6 and the Panasonic S1H. To the best of my knowledge, both of these cameras are using the same sensor, which is manufactured by Sony. Some of you might notice that the body of my camera says S6. Don't be thrown off by that. This is indeed a full-frame camera. You can see next to the actual S6 the difference in sensor size. This is a pre-production unit and they just didn't have a body marked F6. I'll show my rig briefly just so you have some idea of how I shot this, but then I'll jump right into the footage. As with my other comparison videos, I mount the cameras side by side on a bar. They have almost the same perspective, but you'll see there's a slight difference. It's not a big deal. I use a monitor on each camera so I can have a waveform monitor on both. I have an Atomos Ninja V and a Portkeys LH5. I have a V-mount battery for the zcam E2-F6 and just the internal battery for the Panasonic. I did most of the shots in this video with these two Sigma lenses. They are both 35mm f1.4. The only difference is the mount. This E2 has a EF mount, so I'm using the EF lens for that one, and the Panasonic has a Leica L mount. Otherwise, these lenses are exactly the same. Before I even talk about the images that we're seeing, I will say that both of these cameras are capable of capturing a very nice image. I try to optimize the shot for each camera, so I'll try to shoot at a native ISO where it's going to be cleanest. I'm setting the lenses to the same aperture around f4 or 5. I'm using the same type of ND. I'm adjusting it a little bit differently because these cameras expose differently in their native log profiles. The sensor is amazing, and the processing that both zcam and Panasonic are doing in camera is very good. It doesn't affect the image as much as some cameras do. If you're coming from a DSLR world, these cameras are on a different level from most DSLRs. In fact, the E2 is not really a DSLR at all. These cameras are coming from different places. Zcam has never made a DSLR. Their history is more 360 and VR cameras. The E2 was their first cinema camera. Panasonic, of course, has been around a long time, and historically they've made point-and-shoot cameras, the Vericam line of video cameras, and then they, of course, introduced video in their GH line, and they've really been making advances in that area. So their cameras are more that style, more of a point-and-shoot style, as opposed to the cinema-style camera that we have with the E2 series. If you want to know more about the E2-F6 body, it's identical to the S6, and I go into great detail about the body in my S6 review video. I'll link that down below. Looking at this footage, I'll talk about the color first, because I think that's the thing that stands out the most at first glance. I'm surprised by how often the colors match. There's a number of scenes where I almost can't tell which camera is which because the colors look so close. It's pretty amazing. They are using the same sensors, so there's that, but of course the processing is different. There are, however, a number of scenes where the colors are different in specific areas. For example, the water with the river in the different places that I shot, it's different. The Panasonic tends to be a little more yellow or brown, whereas it's more blue on the E2. I may have had the white balance set incorrectly on the Panasonic. That's what it seems like because I can't match these cameras very easily in these shots, whereas most of the other shots I could. It helps if I change the split so that you get a different view of it because apparently one side of the river had a different color than the other side, probably due to the position of the sun or something. And again, here's a difference in the river because I shot these two scenes back to back. So it seems like one of the cameras had the white balance off. This happens when you have it too far one way or the other. It's difficult to correct that color back. You'll get some parts of the image right, but other parts will be very off. That's why it's so important to get the white balance in camera. I'll talk briefly about my white balance method. On the Panasonic, I press the white balance button on the top, and on the first custom white balance setting, I will hold a white balance disc. This presents the camera with a general color of the scene. And I press either the center button or the shutter button, and it sets the white balance automatically according to what it's seeing. In the zcam, there's a couple different ways to do white balance. If you have an auto, it's always adjusting the white balance automatically. And if you assign the white balance lock to a custom function button, you can just press it and it'll lock in that white balance so it doesn't shift or change when you're shooting. You can also set that custom function to just white balance. And if you press and hold it, it will set the white balance according to whatever it's seeing at the moment. And generally that works very well. I don't need to hold that white balance disc in front of the lens like I do on the S1H. I know I flew through that really quickly. You can either go back and watch it again, or I think I might just make a video about white balancing with the E2 series of cameras. You may want to keep an eye out for that video. For grading, I try to use the manufacturer's tools, meaning for the E2-F6, I'm using the zcam color plugin, and for the Panasonic S1H, I'm using the official Vlog to Rec 709 LUT. Now, I've tried using that LUT previously on the GH5, and it just didn't really do a whole lot for it. But here with the S1H, it looks really good. And then before and after those nodes, I'm just doing some luminance adjustments. I'm not really doing a lot of color adjusting, except when I was trying to match the cameras. The only real color I'm doing here is just slight changes in the white balance and the tint. If you've seen my other comparison videos, then you'll recognize these places. I've shot at Riverfront Park and the Louvre Carousel quite a bit. And I do it partially because the consistency, I know what to expect, and so I could actually go back and compare other cameras over time, more or less. Of course, the time of year changes a lot. This was shot in October, and most of the green foliage and flowers were gone. They were dead and dying, which is very different than when I did my S6 video and comparing it to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K when everything was green and flowery and very pretty. I'm holding on this shot a little bit longer because I want to point out how similar these two cameras are here. I've done only luminance adjustments beyond the LUT and the color plugin, no color adjustments, and they are very closely matched. I'll freeze it here on this red shirt to point out that we start to see a difference in some of these pure colors, reds, blues, greens, the strong colors. There's a slight difference between the cameras. You'll see here in the shots at the Comic-Con that the red really jumps out on the Panasonic, and I like the way it looks. The highly saturated colors look particularly good in the Panasonic. They're vibrant, the reds are rich. That's not saying the zcam doesn't look good, it just looks a little different. The reds tend to be more orange or magenta. Now, which one's more true to life? I don't know. I don't remember how red those reds were when I was shooting it. So it's anybody's guess. Just the results I'm looking at, I like the Panasonic colors. I also like the colors in the zcam very much. I do notice that the Panasonic is applying a little more sharpening. I have both cameras set to their lowest sharpened setting. In the zcam, that's called weak. In the Panasonic, it's set to 0 and actually defaults to that as opposed to the GH5 series where it was at 0 and you maybe want to turn it down to -5 to make it look more natural. The Panasonic does look a little more sharpened than the E2 footage. Sharpening tends to have a side effect of increasing contrast. And I do see a difference in contrast. The Panasonic seems to have a little bit more, the way it pulls stuff into the shadows is different than the zcam. Again, it's not necessarily better, just different. This Catwoman is a local cosplayer and model named Alaska Mauve. I'll link to the cosplayers below if I have their information. Skin tones are very good in both cameras. There's really no weirdness, there's no green or yellow oddness going on in either camera. I will say that there's a bit more magenta in the skin tones on the E2-F6 compared to the Panasonic. The Panasonic looks like it's getting it right on the nose, no pun intended. I haven't talked about the IBIS yet. That's the in-body image stabilization. It's a huge difference between these two cameras. The Panasonic S1H has it, and the zcam doesn't. It's something that Panasonic does very well. Not a lot of manufacturers do this. It's an electromechanical system that is physically moving the sensor to counteract your movements. Now, this can be good or bad depending on what you're doing. If you're vlogging, it's a very good thing. It's going to smooth out your footage and make it look a lot better. But if you're shooting, something cinematically controlled, a short film, whatever, you're probably going to want to turn that off so that you have total control. You'll see on the side-by-side shots that sometimes the S1H image is moving differently. It's not lined up perfectly the whole time, and that's the active IBIS. In all this Comic-Con stuff here, I turned it off, and you can see just how shaky it is without it on compared to some of the other footage. I want to jump back into the red color like I talked about earlier. So you can see here how vibrant the red is in her hair. Again, I've only made luminance adjustments outside of the zcam color plugin and the Panasonic LUT. So this is how these images look without any additional color adjustments. And in this shot of the table with the red tablecloth, it's a really nice rich red, and it doesn't look like any of the other colors are being adversely affected, meaning like skin tones look good. So I can try to match that in the zcam, and what I did was apply a key on that red, and then I went into the hue and the saturation and the luminance and just made some adjustments. And I got it pretty close. Again, I'm not sure if that red is really true to life, but I just like the way it looks on the Panasonic. Exposure is, of course, very important when you're shooting. I used an exposure card to make sure that I was relatively close with both of these cameras. Mostly I'm making sure I'm not clipping anything in the highlights or the shadows because they have different log profiles. They're going to move those highlights and shadows into different places, so they're never going to match up perfectly. That middle gray is at a different place for both cameras, and also where they want to have that middle gray exposed is going to be different. Thankfully, with 14 or 15 stops of dynamic range, it's less of a concern. There's a lot of scenes where I was well below the clipping point on either the top or bottom range because you have such a large dynamic range. And here's a high ISO test. I shot this at night and the only light was the corner street light, which is an LED. Interestingly, the zcam is only at ISO 8000 and the S1H is at 25,600, and they achieve roughly the same exposure with these settings. I think what that means is that the cameras are using different numbers for different levels of gain, meaning that maybe that ISO 8000 in the zcam E2-F6 is the same amount of gain that the Panasonic is using at 25,600. Manufacturers don't always agree on these ISO settings. When the E2 first came out, its numbers were drastically different compared to most other cameras. 100 ISO was equivalent to like a 500 ISO on another camera. Anyway, we're seeing about the same amount of noise. It's just the noise looks different in the two cameras. It's a little more prominent in the S1H. It's just smoother in the zcam, and that could mean that zcam is applying a little more noise reduction maybe, or just a different style. Maybe they're doing a better version of noise reduction here. It's hard to say. These shots taken at the Riverfront Park Pavilion are a good opportunity to show off the low light capabilities in these cameras. They have large sensors so they can gather a lot of light. I'm shooting at native ISOs here. I didn't have to bump it up to the second native ISO. I'm at the first native ISO and I have plenty of light. This shadow in the roadway really shows off the noise. And when I zoom in, you can see how the pattern of the noise is different between the two cameras. You know, noise like this is no big deal. If I see noise in my image and it bothers me, I'll use noise reduction software, and I usually get very good results that way. So with these cameras having those large sensors and less noise overall, this noise is really no problem at all. If I put the Panasonic in HLG, there's a lot less noise, so I'm curious to know why there's a difference between Vlog and HLG. Everything I shot with the zcam E2-F6 was in Z-Log C, which is a profile unique to this camera. It's not in any of the other E2 cameras. I tried to do an autofocus test, but for some reason the zcam just wasn't working. I believe some of the menu items were also grayed out, so there's obviously something wrong there. I expect them to fix this in a firmware update maybe. I'm not sure what was going on. If you want to see the focus test with the Panasonic, go to my Panasonic review. I have this test in there. I'm not going to repeat it here. And here is a rolling shutter test. I tested it in different resolutions, and to my eye, they both look very much the same. Here is an open gate, and I can pause it here and show you side by side that, yeah, they look very, very close, just maybe a slight edge to the F6. I can overlap them and show them at the same time, and you can see how they match very, very closely. I did try it with IBIS on and off, and other than moving the image a little bit, it didn't really have any effect on the rolling shutter. Since that is a mechanical movement, it doesn't really have anything to do with the readout speed of the sensor. And again, in different resolutions, I didn't notice a change in the rolling shutter. There might be a measurable difference, but I don't have a way of measuring this accurately. So here in Cinema 4K, it looks the same. And again, I've used this scene here at the creek to show off resolutions and frame rate differences. At 23976, both cameras look very much the same. When we stepped up to 60 frames per second, both of these cameras crop in. So we're getting 4K resolution out of the camera. And again, they look pretty similar still. However, when we jump it up to 1080 120, we go back to the full frame. We're not getting a crop anymore, but I'm seeing some weird artifacts on the Panasonic S1H. I'm not really sure how to explain this. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it, but it looks like defined blocks of compression. I'm assuming this is a bug, and definitely something that they would update in a firmware update. I didn't do enough shooting in 1080 to really know if this was a random fluke or if this was consistent. So you'll have to look towards other people's reviews maybe to see if this is something that's in other cameras. I will take some time to talk about the frame rates and resolutions because we'll find a lot of differences there. The E2-F6 offers more options as far as frame rates and resolutions compared to the S1H. The S1H in general doesn't do as high frame rates at similar resolutions. High frame rates have been kind of zcam's forte. With the E2, they gave us 4K 120 and 160 at a 2.4 to 1 ratio. And basically what it means is they're giving us as much as the sensor is capable of. So this sensor can do a lot of different frame rates. If you look at the spec sheet, there's all kinds of odd frame rates that it will do depending on the resolution. The Panasonic isn't giving us as many options there, and they're not giving us the higher frame rates that the sensor can do. I think that speaks to a limitation in the processing of the camera, or possibly writing that to the media card. It's anybody's guess. The zcam has one large benefit over the S1H. It records in ProRes. Only in certain frame rates, however. It doesn't do all of the higher frame rates, but that sure beats just H.265 and H.264 that you get with the Panasonic S1H. ProRes is generally much easier for computers to play back because it's an all-I codec, whereas H.265 has a complex encoding scheme, and it's harder for computers to decode that. The S1H does have 422 color in some modes in H.265, whereas the zcam is limited to 420 color in H.265. Also, the zcam has ZRAW pending in a future firmware update. Another big benefit that the zcam has over the Panasonic is that it always outputs video over the HDMI, even if it's at a lower resolution. The S1H does not output video over HDMI while recording at resolutions above 4K, and that's a big problem. I covered this in my S1H review video. In OpenGate, we're getting roughly the same resolution. There's just a minor difference between the two. The biggest difference is the frame rate. The S1H will only do up to 24 frames per second. It won't do 25. You have to go down to the 5.9K mode to get that PAL frame rate. The field of view is almost exactly the same. It's so small, it's hard to tell in a shot like this. In Cinema 6K, the zcam uses the entire width of the sensor. It's just a crop vertically down from the OpenGate size. The S1H is roughly the same. The dimensions are just slightly different, so it's also a slight crop down from the full size of the sensor. I'm showing everything relative to the OpenGate size of the zcam since it's the largest resolution. Here in Cinema 4K, it's kind of the same story. I don't see a difference in the field of view because both cameras should be using the full width of the sensor for this mode, but the difference is that the zcam goes up to 72 frames and the S1H only does 60. It's important to note that both of these cameras will crop in at frame rates above 48, except in HD, so that means you'll get a windowed crop. You won't get the full width of the sensor at the higher frame rates. I know most of you will think these resolution and frame rate things are tedious, but there are definitely people who find this useful. I know when I'm considering buying a camera, these are things that I look at because it's important to me to know what frame rates I can shoot at, what resolutions I have. It's one of the reasons I wouldn't use the S1H for a lot of my shooting because I use a lot of high frame rates for my cosplay music videos. Beyond the OpenGate mode, the zcam has a 5K 4:3 mode, which would be good for shooting anamorphic. The Panasonic has what I think is an odd mode. It's called 4K anamorphic, but the resolution is significantly smaller than the other resolutions. It's below 4K, so sure, you could shoot anamorphic with that mode. It's a good aspect ratio for that, but you're going to have a lot less resolution to play with in post. I'll make one more note here before I move on. The S1H has a slightly wider perspective at 4K because it's still using the full width of the sensor. It's sizing the vertical height to make a 16:9 image, whereas the zcam moves in a little bit to maintain the same height as Cinema 4K. It's just a little narrower. So there's just two different implementations of achieving the same ratio. You end up with a slightly wider field of view on the Panasonic. There are probably 100 things I could talk about in this video comparing these two cameras, but that would have been super boring and it's not really the point. My point was to show off what these cameras do best, and that's produce some amazing images in 6K with great colors. The Panasonic has some unique features that you don't see in the E2-F6, and the E2-F6 takes a little more advantage of the sensor and gives you some higher frame rates and different codec options. I'll post affiliate links in the description below so you can find where to buy these cameras. Please stay tuned because I'll have my E2-F6 review video coming up after this one. And I'll also have a review of the Portkeys BM5 Mark II. It's the second version, so look forward to that. That's going to be one of my last videos this year. I do have another convention in December, and I'll make a cosplay music video from that, and maybe a couple of short videos about using the E2 cameras. Please subscribe if you haven't done that already. Hit that like icon if you liked this video, and hit that notification bell if you want to know when I post my next video. Thanks.